Welcome to Blueprint of an Athlete, where science meets sports. I'm Dr. Robin West. I'm a board-certified orthopedic and sports medicine surgeon, and your host as we explore the intersection of performance, recovery, injury prevention, and innovation. Today, we're breaking down the ground game, literally exploring how innovative cleat engineering is reshaping performance and safety from the ground up. We'll be discussing the Caddix Cleats and how one startup is taking on the traditional cleat industry with data-driven design and a mission to protect athletes. Joining me are two incredible guests. We have Jack Rasmussen, the founder and CEO of Caddix, and also a former All-American collegiate football player who turned a personal observation about injury into a mission to innovate the cleat industry. Dr. Kirk McCullough is a board-certified orthopedic surgeon who's dual fellowship trained in sports medicine and foot and ankle surgery. He serves or has served as a team physician for U.S. Soccer, the NFL, MLS, and NWSL. He's deeply involved in research and injury prevention for the lower extremity and brings a biomechanical and medical lens to how footwear can actually protect athletes. Jack and Kirk, welcome to Blueprint of an Athlete.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Jack, let's start with you. I just want to take you back to the beginning. What sparked the idea for Caddix Cleats? Was there like a single moment or a story or something that made you realize something needed to change how cleats were designed?
Yeah, so the moment that kind of sparked the idea was my father and I were watching a football game 12 years ago, and Jamal Charles, City Chiefs, he went down an open field, blew his knee out, and we were just like, man, it looks so preventable. At the time, I wasn't in school, and he was an advertising guy, so we're like, yeah, we can do this for sure. Then a year goes by, I can't stop thinking about it, so I just wanted to help. I want to see how cleats work. I want to see what was wrong with the cleats from the inside out. So quit my job at the time, sat in my room, and taught myself all the stuff I needed to learn in order to have a conversation about this. Honestly, that was the first step. But watching these players go down with no one around them just looks super weird to me and strange and not sports-like at all. So I thought there was a problem, and the problem was at the feet of the athletes.
And so can you tell me about that early prototype and how it developed from really concept to reality?
Yeah, there were two prototypes that I'm not proud of. The first one was I bought a pair of little kids' cleats from Goodwill. I tore it apart, and I grabbed paper plates. I cut them into small circles and I put them inside the cleat with rubber bands. I try to make it to spin and flex. And I wanted it to give. I wanted it to rotate. I feel like that was the key component I was looking for. And the next one, if you combine quick hardening caulk and blue dish soap, it becomes this transparent rubbery substance you can manipulate. And I cut a sole off a cleat. I put it in this kind of last of this goo, and then I filled it with the same goo, and I had this transparent cleat sole that you could just move and flex. And that's kind of how that was my proof of concept in terms of showing others. I brought that to meetings and schools in front of surgeons and was like, look, it moves. This is what I'm trying to do. So it was a very do-it-yourself version of what I wanted to be, but I had no resources, no background. So that was my first real cleat I made.
I mean, it sounds very innovative and crafty. Or were you naturally that way, or was that something that you were so interested in and you've learned?
Yeah, I feel like I've always been curious, almost to a fault, but this just sparked my interest for some reason. I mean, I at the time had never played football in my life. I was 19 years old. I just played basketball. I had never played a cleated sport. I played soccer when I was in middle school for like 2 years. But no, I just felt, I don't know, I felt this very large, insatiable pull to figure this out. And I don't know, just went for it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that you chose cleats. You know, how did you figure that out, that was the design, that you wanted to make this more flexible cleat? Was that just something you thought of, or was it something you watched and learned? I mean, I know you saw this injury, but how did you?
So I ended up writing the first patent we have when I was 20. And that wasn't for cleats. That was just for a shoe sole in general. I thought the shoe sole could be implemented into a cleated piece of footwear, and basketball shoes, volleyball, tennis shoes, whatever. So I was actually never targeting cleats. It just so happened the first injury I watched and was aware of was a football player who was wearing cleats. But I never wanted just to make cleats. I wanted to make shoes for everybody. But it turns out my first patent, what my dad and I kind of collaborated on, was so impractical from a manufacturing standpoint and just not feasible from a finance standpoint. We had to adjust our approach to that flexible component of footwear. And I got in touch with a team in Oregon called iGenerator. And these guys just know so many things about shoes that you don't understand the nuances of. And I took my goal, my functionality, my desired functionality to them. And they said, well, we can't do this, but we might be able to do it into studs. So that's kind of how the studs became the flexible spotlight of Caddix.
If you can share the cleat, or I don't know if you guys have one and you can show one or tell us a little more about the cleat design. And
Yeah, absolutely. These are the women's ones. Let me back up real quick. So these studs, they just flex. I don't know if you guys can see it, but they just flex like that. Women's right here, and then men's right here.
and
So
how
all
flexible are those cleats? It was hard to see. How much
I
movement do they
know,
have?
I'm sorry. It's
Oh
it's
no.
12 degrees of flexion. It's not too much. It's tough to see on a video camera, that's for sure. But it's 12 degrees of flexion, any direction. Just the front ones. So the back ones are fixed. The front ones move. That's it.
And Kurt, are you able to share how was that determined? How much degree of movement is safe, and also
Yeah,
potentially?
as far as the safety of it, obviously there's a lot of initial considerations as to this balance between performance and prevention or protection. A lot of the limitations as it related to the smart studs had to just do with the nature of the manufacturer, and so that's where our colleagues at iGenerator were critical in being able to understand what was going to be the tolerance level of this design of the smart stud to allow it to rotate and to allow it to pivot, but not for that to be such a potential interaction to where you were going to get catastrophic failure. Because the idea of a shiftable, movable stud was not something brand new. I mean, this is something that the major footwear industry, apparel designers, they have attempted to do it, but it was always with the consideration of something that would screw into the bottom or something that would be from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So Jack and iGenerator's work in that is innovative in the sense that they designed a plate, but then were able to figure out a way to hang the stud from the plate to allow it to shift and to pivot and to have kind of rubber grommet around it to where it would return back to where it started, but still allow it to do that and not have catastrophic failure with prolonged use. And we've had numerous athletes now wear these for over a season and not have any of the issues that previously failed miserably with the prior generations done by others. So as far as the safety of it and the considerations, stud length, those kind of things, I mean, we are certainly continuing to optimize that. But as far as like an exact, hey, it's 15 degrees is okay, 10 is not. What we have found with our 12 degree of ability to shift and flex, it's created zero issues as far as the safety and also amazingly actually an increased performance metric as it relates to the ability of the shoe, even when you're less than perfectly perpendicular to the surface, to be able to grab as it needs, but to be able to release as it has to prevent significant grab, certainly of an artificial surface as well.
And the cleat can be worn on grass and turf, or what's the
Yeah,
artificial turf and grass?
Yeah, it absolutely can. I mean, traditionally, if you think about, hey, we're going to go onto a really soft surface, these are the considerations where athletes of all different type of cleated sports would say, I need to have the really tall,
Right.
fixed stud
Yeah.
with the idea that I'm going to dig in and that the failure is ultimately going to be between the roots of the grass
Yep.
and the deeper dirt, and that the failure was taking a divot. The idea of the Caddix Cleat is now we're creating a biomechanical divot as it relates for the ability of the cleat to release as it needs to from the webbing of an artificial surface, rather than having something that is so efficiently fixed that it's amazing traction, but on the spectrum of torque and injury, obviously can create a traumatic injury as it goes from the foot through the ankle and up the limb.
So interesting. And as we see a lot, Kirk, there are lots of modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors, right, for these lower extremity injuries. And so I guess I'd love to hear from you. First of all, what are the most common non-contact injuries that you see in your sports medicine and foot and ankle practice? And also if you can share some of that science and research around the reasons why these are occurring.
Yeah, as you had mentioned, alluded to, I mean, what we see, especially in the cleated sports, are a lot of the rotational or angular injuries. So whether that be high ankle sprains, as you come up the limb with a high ankle sprain, the commonality of a medial collateral ligament injury with those type of injuries. But then obviously the bigger ones, the ACL type of considerations that we discuss. And obviously, as you say, that's multifactorial. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that besides just a cleat surface interaction. But, it's those rotational type of things that we see. Obviously, inversion and eversion injuries, that I think a lot more of that has to do with what we would consider the width of the shoe and whether or not the foot is falling over the outside of the shoe, because a lot of existing shoe wear, and there's certainly some changes with this, but they were built on more of a runner's shoe, which is a little bit more of a narrow last. And so you'd have a lot of these larger athletes, be it a lineman or even a very tall tight end, receiver, defensive back that have a very wide foot, but then they have an unsupported outside of their foot, what we call the fifth ray or the lateral ray. And so we would see them falling off of the cleat, not even so much that it's rotating, but falling off of that. And that's why even with our initial designs and iteration since, having something that's wider that supports that consideration of the kind of the tripod nature of the foot, you've got to be able to support not only the big toe, but also the fifth ray. So trying to manage those type of things, is certainly what we've got at, but the rotational ones were what we discussed, the high ankle, MCL, ACL, even getting up to the hip. We talk about the hip drop tackling type of considerations that the NFL's taken on. Anything where that shoe engages and won't release and creates a torque mechanism up the chain, we're trying to at least play one role, one part of that, realizing that no shoe out there will ever prevent all injuries. But even if we can decrease some of that force or some of that incidence, can make a huge difference, because for these athletes, the most common interaction any of them have is their shoe with the surface. And for that to have been something that was primarily considered an apparel consideration that would match their uniform, rather than something that's just as important as protecting their head with good helmets, I think is really kind of the crux of why we're here and why we're talking about it.
How do you test these cleats? How do you validate them, and what kind of lab or on-field data do you have that can support Caddix Cleats?
Yeah, so we've tested at University of Virginia BioCore, and they test with a machine called the Beast, and that's kind of the standard for release coefficients as far as cleated footwear goes. So back to your other question, how we got to the 12 degrees of flexion, we actually tested kind of a bracket of rigidity in terms of our stud flexion. So we tested a very loose one, the one we use now, and a very stiff one. And the best performing one in terms of release was the one we use now. So essentially, it's an axial load attached to the cleat, and they rip it until it releases from the ground, and that's how they measure it. So they do it on 12 artificial, 12 grass. So just an array of situations. And that's kind of the standard for the NFL as well. I can't speak on much soccer testing. I'm sure Kirk can, but that is kind of the golden standard for cleat testing, at least.
So, there are traction tests as it relates to things that are moving in a translational pattern. There's the rotational considerations. And then obviously there's also, you can't completely forego the performance element of it. So there will be athletes that will go and test these in different type of cutting, pivoting maneuvers and compare different things. And so there's that subjective or kind of participant or wearer's type of interaction and evaluation of it, in addition to a biomechanical. And arguably it's kind of a marriage of the two. The other thing that we also do, at least in the NFL, is there's a consideration of a flexionator test. So basically, in thinking about the last and how much it can flex as you're performing various maneuvers, or at least to be able to see, is it too flexible? Is it too rigid? And the considerations of that as far as the, turf toe injuries, which are hyperextension injuries of the big toe, midfoot type of sprains, Liz Frank injuries. That's also at least a part of that testing apparatus that the NFL has done now for multiple seasons.
And we've also done testing with athletes, like Kirk alluded to, at BYU, because when I came out with this, I thought that athletes would be slower because the studs are moving, not by much, but something. So we tested with a 1080 resistance machine, 40 drills, 5-10-5 L drills. We did broad jumps. We did vertical. We actually tested better than any other cleat across the board. We had faster times in every single category. So I think that paired with the decades of white pages and the BioCore testing and the flexionator testing and translate, that's kind of our bread and butter, even though a lot of those results are privately owned. Unfortunately, we can't really show to the masses, but we're working on different public-facing tests that we'd be happy to share as soon as they're done.
That's terrific. You're talking about all the science behind it, and I'm sure that the athletes like to hear that, but athletes really want to know about how does it feel, right? That's what they care about, and they want to know how they perform. So you've shown that performance side, but how about the feedback? What kind of feedback have you gotten from athletes and teams as far as that comfort and that feeling of performance?
So when I started doing this, my business partner and I, who was my college quarterback, we actually made a survey and sent it to 1,000 college athletes. And the consensus was that cleats have always sucked. Let's just call it what it is. They're tough to break in. There's no room for your toes. There's no padding. They're too rigid in some areas. So we took that into consideration and built a cleat around all of those results. So that being said, these cleats have minimal to no break-in period. The toe box is wider. There are no pressure points to the stiffer plate like Kirk mentioned. for arch support so you don't get turf toe injuries. And the women's cleat is actually made after women's last, which is a rarity in this field. A lot of cleat companies will just make men's cleats and market them and label them as women's cleats, but there's nothing different about them between the men's ones. That's our strong point, is our feedback from athletes, because people and athletes, both men and women, lacrosse, football, soccer, they love these things. I mean, they are exactly how cleats should be made. We've had feedback from people saying they want to cut the studs off and wear them as shoes, and I'm like, please don't do that. These are expensive. But no, it's a visceral reaction every time we have someone try them on in front of us. And thank goodness the bar has been set so low. It really has. So we've exceeded it, but no, people like how they feel, and they're made with athletes in mind.
Well, so inspiring. I'm sure it's really inspiring, right? To be there when they try on the cleat and give it a try.
I think the interesting thing here is that it's, the concern that Jack mentioned initially with putting something like this on, or thinking about it theoretically. It's like, well, if you mention that you have something that will move, like the concern is like, well, I'm going to feel like I slip. And once again, that is a consideration of it being a perfect perpendicular interaction. But one, as far as the performance, the reality of how inefficient and imperfect we are in engaging our surface is the number one thing. But also the consideration of having efficiency with inefficiency. Most of the time when people talk about a break-in period with their cleat, what that is it's not the stud with the plate. It's how the upper is stretching on the plate. So it takes a while to break in because that's how long it's taking the stitching and the upper and everything to be able to stretch and move. But all that's creating is your foot not engaging with something consistently, but rather starting to be able to shift. Whether that becomes blistering, whether that becomes other problems, that's the break-in period. With this, you don't have to have that, because now the subtle inefficiency is in how those studs are engaging, which gives you the performance when you're imperfect, but also gives it the ability for the stud plate interaction to absorb that, rather than it being the last or some type of friction moment that's occurring between your external skin or sock and the shoe. So it's really interesting how you don't think about that maybe when you're initially designing it, but then that's the feedback that we find, that they do not have to break this in nearly as long, and they're not seeing some of those same other inefficiencies that created problems between the shoe and the foot. And because now it's the shoe with the surface absorbing some of that negative interaction.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's been the biggest barrier to widespread adoption?
Money?
I think I wasn't going to say that, Kirk.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's awareness. I mean, in the end, you don't know what you don't know. And I mean, I would love to hear Jack describe to you what our marketing budget has been. But I mean, like if we talk about this, like compared to going up against this, I mean, this is just awareness. But Jack, please enlighten.
Yeah, I think money's the answer, but I think it's coming from different angles. So we're competing with companies who've had a 60-year head start. That's pretty tough, and they've been making money for 60 more years. So, but Kurt's kind of about our marketing spend is we raised the Series C last year, and it was a few $1,000,000. And cleats aren't exactly cheap to make in terms of the quantities that we're making them in. But I think one of the biggest hurdles for us, and this goes back to money, is that these other companies are paying or getting paid from these schools for apparel contracts. And, you can't wear X if you are signed to Y, even though X is what's better for you and it's proved to be better for your feet, and doesn't matter, Y doesn't want you to. So I think that's a hurdle as well. But also it's not a novel concept in terms of it's never been attempted before, but it's a novel concept in the public eye. I mean, studs aren't supposed to move, studs have been fixed since studs were around. So that adoption is a little bit slower when people have to take time to wrap their head around what they're looking at. I always tell my business partner, I'm like, man, I wish we sold a dumb product. You know what I mean? I wish we just sold a stupid thing that no one had to understand, but you do have to understand it. But the good thing is that the biggest advocates and the people who understand the most are the high profile athletes who have been on fields for 20, 30 years almost. So that's kind of our target, because if you get them to understand, then they'll tell their friends and their equipment managers and their trainers and their coaches, and that's that organic marketing that we kind of anchor ourselves to. Because as a business owner, I hate spending money, and I think we've spent a total of maybe 20 grand on marketing in the past 12 months, and we know we're doing great.
Yeah, you guys are doing the word ads and
yeah. But in terms of trying to scale this thing and get that notoriety, that widespread adoption, we're gonna have to spend money, and We're going to spend money against companies who spend way more in a month than we would in 3 years. So it's an uphill battle, but it's a battle that I'm looking forward to, honestly.
You focus really on soccer, football, lacrosse, it sounds like. What was your earliest, easiest adoption? What sport kind of took to quickly?
Lacrosse. Yeah,
Women's or
lacrosse
men's or?
both by a long shot. Well, lacrosse is this massive untapped market that no one really spends time and money on, because if you're not from the East Coast, you haven't really heard about it until probably 5 years ago. But I grew up in Baltimore, which is the lacrosse mecca. I never
Yeah.
played, but all my friends did. So it's just like this. It's like a religion over there. From like
Yeah.
North Carolina to Boston, it's like a
Yeah.
religion. So they've been begging for someone to give something to them and make it their own. And cleats, they always get the hand-me-downs, I feel like, from football and soccer. I mean, a lot of college programs wear men's football cleats for women's lacrosse. So like I said, thank God the bar is set so low, but lacrosse adopted it, and sort of football, because football, I think once you get a pair into the locker room, which is what happened last year when Joe Flacco wore them for the Colts, and that kind of just spread throughout the league. Soccer has been our trickiest one, because I think soccer players are so much more analytical about what they put on their body and what they trust in terms of equipment, which I deeply appreciate. I mean, if you wave something shiny in front of a guy playing football, they're going to do it. You know what I mean? So yeah, but Kirk can probably speak on soccer more than I can.
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to soccer, one of the tricks is that a lot of times I look at soccer cleats kind of like ballerinas look at their ballet shoes, except they have studs on the bottom, and so it's something that they're wearing that a lot of times is a half size or a size too small. They want it to be custom, because at least the athletes at the highest level, they feel like the only cleat they're going to wear is something where they've had a 3D molded, kind of imprint of their foot, and then someone's going to make something to that. Now, do they think much necessarily beyond that as it relates to the studs and the plates and how that's interacting? I think they kind of trust the shoe designers to do the rest, but it's all going to be, how does this exactly contour and make me feel as secure as possible in the upper to my foot, and a little bit less as to the considerations of, what's the width? Am I worried about my fifth metatarsal? Those kinds of things. And so it's as Jack said, I think that the bar is higher as it relates to, if this isn't custom for me, there's no way it's going to be good for me. And there's a lot that's been poured into that by certain companies. And there's just a little bit higher of a mountain they have to climb to get people to do it. But for those that have worn it in those sports, certainly Kayla Sharples in women's soccer, the ones that have gone through injury and have understood that the existing market options are not great, it is easy to get the buy-in to realize something needs to be different with them. What we're trying to help people understand is that there's a prevention effort beyond these prevention measures in muscular training, such as FIFA 11 Pro and some of these other things that they can do beyond just saying, well, FIFA mandates that we're all going to play on natural grass, and if I play on natural grass, I'll be protected, and it's not that simple.
It's this buy-in that you have to continue to build.
Correct.
Jack, what would you say is really the toughest challenge? I know there's been lots of challenges, trying to develop these and grow the brand, but whether it's in manufacturing, funding, convincing skeptics, what would you say has been the toughest challenge?
God, there's so many to choose from.
There are a lot to choose from.
I'd say the toughest one probably was trying to raise money a year and 8 months ago. I had all these prototypes I made in my garage. I had a patent. I had some data that proved my theory was right. But it's tough to raise money when you have no product, no tangible hold in your hand proof, and no background. I studied recreational management at a college where there's 100% acceptance rate, and I was a punter. Like, that's not exactly a great resume for fundraising. So, but I think the tough thing was trying to get money. And then we went viral on Instagram like once a week for a month. And then I had everyone asking me to invest. And I was like, oh, it just needed to take a different approach. It's not some kid asking for money. It's a video with 4 million views in 3 hours. And it's a picture of Joe Flacco wearing him. And like, now it's this crazy fear of missing out moment where I still get emails about fundraising. I got 3 today, actually, and we're not looking for money right now. But I think that was the hardest part. And I said earlier, also getting people to understand that this novel concept isn't a hoax. It's not a gimmick. It's just, if you take a look and think outside the box for a second about what footwear has always been as it relates to how we play sports, it shouldn't be as novel as a concept as we think it is. But convincing the outside world who don't play sports, or convincing the parents whose children play sports and they haven't played in 20 years, like, that's also an uphill battle. for sure.
Sure. I mean, there's been lots of challenges. Kirk, here's kind of a tough question, but how do
Yeah.
you balance innovation with risk, liability, and scientific rigor?
Yeah, it's the brutal honesty about it. Because if you come out guns a-blazing saying, now we have a cleat that's going to prevent all injury, like you're going to immediately lose the credibility in people that understand that this is not a singular event or an isolated moment type of thing, but rather a collection of things. So I think it's being intellectually honest about what it is. And then I also just think that it's the reality that we have something and there's biomechanical considerations to it, but until there's enough adoption of that and you have enough people in it, I mean, there's always going to be an inherent distrust. And some of that mountain that Jack was talking about that we have to climb with this is that I think there's a little bit of distrust that everyone knows how financially successful Nike and Adidas and some of these others are. And in a realm where you're coming in as a little mouse against these whales, it's like, how is it possible that with all the resources that these other institutions would have, that someone could come up with something that hasn't already been figured out? There has to be some type of catch. There has to be some type of ulterior thing or something else, or you're hiding something. Like there's something too simplistic about it. And look, I think that's a seeing and feeling and wearing is believing. I think the key is being honest about it and realizing also that even with what we have, it's not as good as it's going to be or it will be, but we're going to get there. And that the more people start to understand that even with an initial first line product that we have, the testing of that product is real. And I think the understanding that people need to come to is realizing how archaic everything has been to this point and not automatically assuming that just because you have a multi-billion-dollar industry, that everything about that industry has been optimized. I mean, some of this has been a race to the floor as far as how cheaply, how efficiently, how mass production-wise can we make something and sell it for a maximal margin to be able to then allow us to continue to gobble everything else up. Some of this has maybe been the negatives of capitalism, but it also creates an opportunity in this type of market for something that is better once people understand that same market can also drive something small to be something great. It's just a matter of getting that information out to the public, understanding where we are and where we could be and what this potential opportunity provides to them.
Yeah, your passion is so inspiring. Both of you and your commitment to athlete safety. Jack, what's next for Caddix? Any expansion to any other sports, surfaces? What's the next idea?
Lots of plans for Caddix. We're going to expand other sports. That's all I want to say about it.
Yep.
But we're definitely going to expand other sports. Right now, our cleats double as men's football, men's lacrosse, women's soccer. And we're going to separate that pretty soon and make separate lines. But yeah, we have lots of plans. I think the big question about Caddix is, like Kirk mentions, like no one in compared to the size of sports has heard of Caddix. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, a very small fraction has. I think it's scaling from within, so we can scale from within, so we can scale the external in terms of retail demands, sports, reach, all that stuff that I got to worry about. But without being too specific, we have a lot of big plans for Caddix, absolutely. And a lot of it is through Dr. Kirk McCullough, which I'm lucky to have on our team because he's helping this thing move. It's fun to watch.
That's great. Dr. McCullough, where do you see footwear research heading over the next decade? I'd say, smarter materials, embedded sensors, adaptive traction.
Yeah, in the same way we've seen computer and even AI technology change so significantly with things that we can provide more with less. I think what we're going to find is that with some of these scenarios that we have where we can now use markerless technology to identify, motion capture and understand things biomechanically with pressure sensor related inserts and the ability to be able to test things now within a shoe rather than it having to be something external. A lot of these different technologies that have benefited other industries, I see them starting to work in this realm that are going to allow us to understand things on a much more granular level rather than things that were away from the athlete and the movement and everything that are just going to help us understand it. And our just ability to compute and to process that data, especially with AI, allows us to do things that were otherwise kind of bogged down by the computational nature of it. I really see a lot of explosion with that over the next 3 to 5 years.
Exciting. So I'd like to close now with some takeaways that you can give to athletes, coaches, medical professionals. So what's your personal blueprint or a guiding principle that's kind of shaped how you have worked, competed, or innovated? Key takeaway from each of you.
I want to hear Kirk go first.
Yeah. So, and Robin, I know this is true with you as well. I mean, it's one thing to go through things as an athlete, and so I was an athlete that was certainly a suboptimal specimen coming into the arena, and so I clearly broke down in multiple occasions and kind of fall back on some of the frustration that I had with that, even seeing in how my injuries were managed a few decades ago and what we know now. But it's one thing to go through that and have that to drive me to try to provide that for other people. I mean, and that's not an uncommon theme. That's nothing unique to me. That's what got me into this. But take it to another level to where now it's, as a father, having now young athletes come through, the passion that I think you will, a lot of people will personally feel, and for me and for key folks for us, like Joe Flacco and Todd Heap and Dennis Pitta, like there was nothing like those athletes that have been to the highest level, but yet know the intricacies of it, know where the deficits are, and now they have their kids coming through, and they're like, doggone it, like some of this stuff is the exact same stuff that I had to struggle with, and I want it better for the next generation. That's what I think is going to push this, because that's no longer a monetary consideration. That is a generational improvement, generational survival thing. And that's, I think, the legacy that we're talking about here, because no longer is it how am I going to get my next contract? This is, how am I going to allow my generation and the generation after that to be able to not struggle with the same things that I had to struggle with at the expense of other things? And so I see a legacy changing thing as it relates to imparting that passion onto other people to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we could be, but to get at the core of that for them and help us take this to a level it's never been, if nothing else, because of the people that are going to follow you, rather than just trying to kind of protect self. So that's kind of the thing when I engage with trainers and performance people and coaches and athletes. This is something that's way beyond just the singular benefit, because ultimately fixing problems after they already happen, Robin, obviously you and I appreciate that, but the prevention of those problems, that's like giving a person a fish compared to teaching them how to fish for others. That's the generational legacy that we want to.
Wow. I know I asked him to go first, but I wish I hadn't. Because
That's a hard one to follow.
That is tough to follow, Kirk.
I was like, that's, yeah.
I know.
Your passion's contagious, really.
I know. Who invited this guy? So I think my blueprint is, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and I think everyone in Baltimore had their fair share of issues and problems. And I watched a lot of my friends become not my friends because they got arrested or were killed, unfortunately. Like I think those guys weren't in sports, and I didn't care what was going on with my house at the time or school. If I knew I had practice at 4 p.m., I wasn't doing a thing that day to jeopardize that, And I think as it pertains to injury, if you tear ACL and you're 13 years old in Baltimore and you're out for 9 months, I guarantee you those 9 months are filled with nothing but detrimental things to your health and life. And I think that whenever I see a friend of mine from high school, even back then when I was in high school, have all these college Division I offers and full rides and then get driven away in a cop car during lunch, I'm like, I don't know. And then we have injury, which in my mind is not preventable, but it can be cared for a little more. So that's my kind of blueprint. It's like, how do we get kids to not be afraid of their sport as it relates to injury, but how do we get kids to actually stay in sports, because there's a million reasons why you shouldn't. And I don't think your footwear should be one of them. I really don't. So that's my whole blueprint.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing it. Obviously, it's a modifiable risk factor. And Kirk, we always talk about these modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. There are things that we can't change, right? There's some safety things we can't change, unfortunately, and anatomic things, but this is something we can change. So I love what you guys are doing and love your passion. And I really want to thank you so much for sharing your time and insight today. It's so inspiring to see your commitment to excellence and your thoughtful design that's grounded in science that can truly change the game for athlete safety and performance. So for listeners who want to learn more, I assume they can go to caddix.com. Is that correct, Jack?
Yep, caddix.com.
All right, great. Well, until next time, I'm Dr. Robin West. This is Blueprint of an Athlete, where science meets sports. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.